So hello again, and thank you very much, and welcome all of you to Better Ballymun. Thanks for joining us. Our next speaker in the Fair Trade and Food Talks series is going to be Irene Sullivan. Irene is an education officer for Global Action Plan, and her specialisation is in biodiversity. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to her.
Thanks, Alex. Hey everyone, thanks a million for coming along. I'm here today to talk about the relationship between how we produce food and biodiversity, and how we rely on biodiversity to feed ourselves, but the manner in which we produce food impacts biodiversity in a number of ways. So if you think about biodiversity itself, it's just another word for nature, really. So it's a word that describes the variety of life on Earth. And we need biodiversity to provide us with clean air, clean water, carbon storage, and the diversity of species that we actually eat. And that's something that I think we're quite removed from now, because we rely on such a few number of species in terms of what we need in our diet. But there is actually a huge, broad diversity of seeds out there that we would have probably relied on more in the past. And they're actually, many of them are facing extinction because they aren't being explored as food sources. But this is sort of a wasted opportunity, because the more seeds we lose, the more opportunities we lose in terms of exploring what could be drought resistant, what could be flood resistant. Basically the organisms or food types that we could use in just a less climate friendly future. I might go to the next slide, Chair, if that's okay. So this graph shows the state of biodiversity historically, in the present, and how it's projected into the future. So basically, since industrialization and the agricultural revolution, biodiversity has really suffered. So it's experienced a decline right back since the industrial revolution, but it's continually gotten worse. And this is a result of a variety of reasons. So from climate change to invasive species, whole host of reasons really, pollution. But agricultural development is one of the main reasons for biodiversity loss. So every time we have encroached upon habitats to create food for ourselves and grow food for ourselves, we have deforested areas, we've drained wetlands, we've converted land from what it's supposed to be into what is useful for us. And there's nothing wrong with this to an extent, but it's just gotten to such a sort of grotesque magnitude that it's resulted in huge biodiversity loss. So if we are to take up really concerted conservation efforts, we could see the future we have in the green line in the graph here. But the latest International Panel on Climate Change report has found that we would need to dedicate between 30 to 50% of all land for nature to have a chance of recovering. And this has huge implications for land use for people, especially because our population is predicted to grow. So we need to feed the people we have on Earth, but we also desperately need nature to be in a good state in order to do that. So it's quite the situation. But yeah, if we have increased conservation efforts, then we can, at least make some improvement. But if we continue in the format of business as usual, that will spell disaster for biodiversity. I'm sorry to be the one to remind you of that, but we might go to the next slide. So the ways in which we have affected biodiversity through agriculture are quite diverse. They vary from the application of pesticides and fertilizers, which have reduced our number of insect species. So 500,000 species of insect is now threatened with extinction. Habitat loss is also a feature, which I mentioned earlier. So there's been a 68% decline in wildlife populations since 1970. And a lot of this is traced back to habitat loss, not just for agriculture, but for development generally. Pollution is also a major issue, and this can come from agricultural runoff as well, so runoff of fertilizers and things like that. And then we have overexploitation, so that's essentially overfishing, over-extraction of natural resources, taking more than can be replenished. Next one, please. And on the flip side of this, so despite the fact that we have made huge progress in getting much more cheap food for greater numbers of people. There are 690 million people who are still hungry, and there's 2 billion people who lack essential micronutrients in their diets. So there's a huge disparity between access to food, and some people, like the wealthy people in the global north, can access a diversity of foodstuffs, but there are people all over the world who rely on a very small, constricted diet. And we know from our experience in Ireland, well, not our experience, but our ancestral experience, that relying on one crop is never a good idea. And nature loathes the monoculture, and monoculture has become, so monoculture is essentially the cultivation of one single crop in favour of a diversity of crops. And this is because those one crop on its own tends to be the most profitable. They can be known as cash crops. But as I said, nature loathes monoculture. So we're kind of, scientists and farmers are looking into ways of using polycultures again, so a diversity of species, so that we can protect nature a bit better. But yeah, there are also other issues that exacerbate this problem, and that is trade agreements. They can sometimes increase supply of foods which are actually linked to obesity. So, for example, in Mexico, imports like sugar and corn syrup from the United States have really negatively impacted the population there. And as I mentioned, the population is projected to increase. So we need to find a way to feed everybody, mitigate obesity, and also do that within what the planet can provide for us, and regenerate and rejuvenate what is there. Next one, please. So yeah, I mentioned earlier that 30 to 50% of the Earth's land, freshwater and ocean areas need to be, the 30 to 50% of land needs to be given back to nature for it to recover. And this is really challenging when it comes to feeding people. So it's going to be hard. So what way can we marry conservation efforts and agricultural production? So next one, please. One way to do this is through a term called, or a process called regenerative agriculture. So this is kind of wordy, and I know this is a big infographic, but essentially regenerative agriculture relies on the principle of do no harm, and develop as large a yield as you possibly can within the concept of doing no harm. So it incorporates things like integrated pest management. So that is where you encourage natural predators of pests to come in and look after them for you instead of spraying pesticides or herbicides. There are things like no-till systems, which essentially means disrupting the soil as little as possible and keeping the carbon within the ground. Rotating crops, and then you lose your reliance on monoculture. And using livestock and cover crops in a way that actually keeps carbon within the soil instead of releasing it. So yeah, it's essentially an approach that puts nature center and foremost, and the yields can actually, in many cases, be bigger than in situations where your typical industrial agricultural approach is used. However, there are obviously, it varies within context, but the nice approach with regenerative agriculture is that it is context dependent. So it's sensitive to the fact that your approach to growing food is going to be different in Ireland than it is in Mozambique, for example. So we might go to the next one. So essentially, when we think about how we can look after biodiversity and feed everybody, we need to take a holistic approach to the relationship between agriculture, human health, trade, and the environment. So up until now, these have been very much boxed off and isolated from each other. So we need to take an integrated approach to all of these things. So how can we ensure that everybody gets the nutrients they need? How can we ensure that the approach to agriculture is fair to people and planet? And how can we encourage trade to become fair and to become equitable rather than to be extractive? So next one, please. So this is kind of where fair trade comes in, and I was fascinated to find out so much more about fair trade than I knew before preparing for this talk. And I was really heartened to see that fair trade encourages people to conserve, regenerate, and plant forests. So it really encourages an agroecological approach to agriculture as well. So that's when you incorporate forestry into farming systems in a way that is holistic and is sensitive to the biodiversity that should be on that farm. And fair trade participants are encouraged and supported not to use chemicals as much as your conventional agriculture. And they're also encouraged to take integrated pest management approaches. And also the bare bones of fair trade is that it encourages a new approach to trade. So the unfair systems and unjust ways in which the global north has essentially extracted wealth from the global south can be mitigated at least somewhat by returning power to the producer. So I think when we're thinking beyond fair trade and its development into the future, we're going to need an approach that demands more of our trade systems, demands them to be fairer and more equitable, and takes a democratic approach to trade systems and affords producers the opportunity to use their voice in a way in which it will be heard at an equal level to those making the decisions on how much money is generated from the final product. And then this will feed back into care for the land, because if people are looked after and they can make sufficient money from what they're already producing, they won't need to expand into more land, deforesting more land. You can see there's been a massive crisis in terms of palm oil production or beef production in Brazil, palm oil production more so in Malaysia and Asia. But these things didn't need to get as bad as they did. It was mostly trade laws that resulted in this kind of thing. So essentially, when we're thinking about how we can incorporate biodiversity properly into our food systems in the future, it's about acknowledging that it's actually vital for our food production systems. So we rely hugely on pollination by insects. We rely on what nature provides for us. We rely on healthy soils. Much of our soils globally are pretty degraded at the moment. So we need to take a concerted effort to bring those back to a healthy state. And that will also result in carbon sequestration as well. So essentially, it's about taking a holistic approach to this problem. And I think that's it, really. I'd love any questions that you might have, fire away. I hope that wasn't a bit too technical and boring, but I should have put in jazz hands or something. Thank you so much. Míle buíochas.